Hello everybody and welcome to our Meet the Finance faculty presentation. So this morning we're going to talk to two of our professors here in the finance department at Gies, and basically the idea of today's session is to talk a little bit about the teaching, what your classes will look like, but also understand a little bit about what your faculty do, what they research, what their backgrounds are, and what expertise they're going to bring to the classroom. So we hope today's session will last just around an hour. Obviously, there's a chance for you to ask questions too. We've received the questions you sent in advance. And so if you think of something during the session, the questions via the wonderful technology in our studio will arrive to me during our session today. So as I always have to, I have to have some slides before we start, just to describe a little bit about our faculty and the department. So the finance department is pretty large. We have around 45 faculty members. They're split pretty evenly between our tenured or tenure track professors who they do teach classes, but a lot of their time and as much as they can is spent doing high quality research. Interesting fact, our research is exceptionally high quality. I think depending on the research rankings you look at, we typically rank in the top 20 in the world. Oh, let me get my pen back. Just 1 second. There's my pen. So let's write, nope, I'm still struggling with my pen. There we go. Top 20, that's all I wanted to write because I forgot to put it in my slides last night. So yes, we are exceptionally well regarded for our research. Now, of course, many of you are coming here for a professional degree to learn how to get a job in industry. Why is it that we care about the research? Well, that's a question I'm going to ask of our panel members slightly later on. Of course, it's important. Finance is a continually evolving field. Understanding the latest trends, what the latest research says, is very important in the classroom and for learning what happens in industry and in your classes. Now, they complement perfectly with our specialized faculty. So our specialized faculty, these are either teaching experts, so they would teach a large number of classes, or they come from industry. So many of our specialized faculty have decades of experience in either banking, investment banking, fund management, things like that. And so in more practical classes, maybe like an portfolio management class or risk management class, you might have a specialized faculty who can bring their expertise from industry into the classroom. So as you'll see, you're going to have a mixture. When you arrive in the program, all of our tenured faculty, I think, I did a check yesterday, I think all of our tenured faculty teach in the program. You'll often see those in our required courses. So our investments and economics courses which are required are both taught by tenured faculty members. And so loosely speaking, your classes by the tenured faculty will be a little more rigorous, and they're going to talk to you about relevant up-to-date finance theory. And of course, my panel members may disagree with me later, but that's the idea behind what they will bring to the classroom. And then sort of our more practical classes are typically taught by a specialized faculty. And loosely speaking, they'll be focused on applications, real-world scenarios, bringing in real case studies that the professors have worked on in their class, in their industry experience. Okay, now, I'm not supposed to talk too much today, but I always talk too much, so I'm going to quickly go to our faculty. We're very lucky to have two professors here today. We have Julian Reif. He's an associate professor of finance and other things. I won't read out all of your different titles, Julian. And we have Russ Irani, who's also an associate professor of finance. He has slightly fewer things, and the Julian Simon Memorial Faculty Fellow. Now, research interest-wise, I won't read out the slides here. I'm going to ask them a little bit in a little while to describe their research to us. So, without further ado, what I'd like to do is switch emphasis over to our panel members. So, gentlemen, let me ask you a nice straightforward question to begin with. How did you arrive at Gies? So what is your path to get to Central Illinois? Julian, do you want to start?
Sure, yeah. So, I received my bachelor's in economics from Vanderbilt University. After that, I worked for 3 years in the consulting industry in Washington, D.C. After that, I returned to school to get a PhD in economics from the University of Chicago, and then drove 2 hours south to arrive here at the University of Illinois where I've been since 2012, so a little over 10 years.
Russ, what about you?
Yeah, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're coming from. It's very nice to meet all of you virtually. Yeah, you can call me Russ. Russ is fine. I've been here. I've also been here since 2012. We joined in the same year. So I'm from the UK originally. I did my pre-doctoral stuff in England at the London School of Economics and Oxford University. Oh, it's very off-putting seeing a picture of yourself right here. This is the worst thing about doing these things is you have to look at yourself. Then I worked in investment banking in London for a couple of years at Morgan Stanley. Lots of early mornings there, and I then came across the pond to New York University where I did my PhD, and then so since 2012 I've been here at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. It's a great place, so we're very happy here, and it's been a pleasure teaching and doing research here and all the rest of it.
So you bring up your research there. So tell us a little bit about your research and sort of what is the implications of your research for finance and maybe what it brings to the classroom. So do you want to start, Julian? So what is it you research when you're not in the classroom?
Sure. So most of my work centers around risk and insurance theory, consumer theory. I also do research on employee benefit programs that a lot of corporations spend money on. So that's one area I've been working in recently. A lot of this is centered around the healthcare space. So for example, here at Illinois, together with my colleague David Molitor, we have been studying the effects of workplace wellness programs. This is sort of a $10 billion industry that has become very popular over the last 15 or 20 years. Many corporations will spend lots of money on these programs in order to reduce the healthcare costs of their workers, as well as hopefully to increase their worker productivity. But there's lots of questions as to whether or not these programs actually work. Do they, in fact, deliver the supposed return on investment that insurance companies have been claiming? So my colleagues and I have been implementing what we call a randomized controlled trial. In the corporate space, you sometimes call this A/B testing to estimate what are, in fact, the effects of these programs. And so we collected a lot of data and ran an experiment, and we concluded, in fact, that it looks like these programs deliver a lot less than what was promised initially. So that's one of the current areas I'm working on.
I think that was picked up by some national newspapers. Is that we won a study?
Yeah, so we've published a couple papers on this project. So it was covered in the New York Times and in the Wall Street Journal, in part because what we found was very surprising. There had been many papers estimating the effects of these programs, and they had all thought that these programs delivered very large benefits. We got a very different answer from our research study. And the reason is because we were using modern causal inference tools. Prior studies had been using, without getting too technical, essentially just a very simple correlational analysis, which is well known today to not be a good way to understand the causal effects of a program. And so we were able to show that these older methodologies, in fact, gave you the incorrect answer. Using a modern causal inference method, by contrast, would give you the correct answer, which turned out to be quite different. So I think this generated quite a lot of interest in the industry and among corporations in particular who had been paying for these programs. And so I think that's what was covered a lot in the press.
What do you think the harder question, what do you think the corporations are going to do with your data? Do you know? Have you talked to, are they going to spend more or spend less? What's the sort of feeling?
That's a good question. So, I mean, the corporations involved in the workplace wellness sector were not, of course, very happy with these findings because it suggests the product is potentially less valuable than they had been claiming. As far as other corporations, I think it still remains to be seen whether or not they will dial back the amount of money they're investing in these programs. It takes years for these things to sort of work their way out, and I haven't seen the latest numbers in terms of what is being spent in this industry. So I think we'll see how much people are paying attention or not. So,
Russ.
Yeah, I mean, I'm one of these people that's very fortunate to do teaching and research in the same area, which is money, banking, financial institutions, risk management, financial regulation. And so my research, that's what I do. All of my teaching is focused in that area. And, most of my teaching is focused in that area. But my research is exclusively focused in that area. So, some of the work I've done over the years has been looking at how corporations operate in credit markets, how they borrow in credit markets, how banks lend in credit markets, how they manage the risk associated with those lending activities. I've done work that looks at financial regulations that apply restrictions to either financial institutions or the agents borrowing in those markets. Most recently, I've been doing a study on the mortgage market in the Netherlands, of all places, where we try to understand how a class of regulations referred to as macroprudential regulations targeting arguably excessive borrowing by households in the mortgage market, how those types of restrictions can rein in on that sort of borrowing and hopefully lead to greater resilience among these households in the face of the kinds of shocks they face. So loss of income, loss of employment. More recently, we're looking at the run-up in interest rates. So in the US, we have this wonderful mortgage product. We have the 30-year fixed rate mortgage. That's not really something you see in other countries. I grew up in the UK. In the UK, there's no such thing as a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. So when we think about interest rate risk management and how households deal with a run-up in interest rates, say as the central bank raises policy rates, we want to understand how that transmits to the economy, how that transmits to household spending, consumption, and so on. In countries like the Netherlands, it's more interesting because all of these mortgages, and the UK for that matter, they're all floating rate. So we can actually see a direct transmission from what the central bank is saying and doing to how households are dealing with higher interest expenses. And whatever, you guys in the audience may come from countries all around the world where you're thinking about these issues, much more so than households in the US. I mean, I'm fortunate here in the US, I have this lovely 30-year fixed rate mortgage, so I'm completely unaffected by the recent interest rate cycle. So we've been looking at these macroprudential regulations in the Netherlands, and the idea is that they're supposed to make households more resilient. They do less borrowing. They're supposed to make those households more resilient to these types of interest rate shocks or income loss or whatever, because you have less borrowing, you have less debt to service essentially. And so we're well positioned there to understand that how the most recent run up in interest rates, which we've seen in the US, we've seen in the UK, we've seen with the European Central Bank as well, how that's going to transmit to these households. And we have a better understanding of how, many times these regulations are rolled out with the best of intentions. They're rolled out by central banks and by governments around the world with little, with a rough understanding of how they work, but with little kind of detailed, careful research into the precise effect of these policies, and in particular how they affect different types of households in different types of ways. And so that's where this more recent study that I've been working on kind of fits in. Earlier work I've done focuses on financial regulations and both their intended and unintended effects on financial institutions themselves. So in other work, we've looked at how we're currently going through the rollout of Basel III, which is a regulation on essentially loss-bearing capacity of large financial institutions. So Basel III Endgame is the most recent buzzword. And we did some work, Basel III, they've been rolling out Basel III for 15 years now. And so we did some work on understanding the rollout of Basel III and how it affects intermediate or borrowing and lending by traditional financial institutions, but also how that might, as we kind of rein in these traditional financial institutions and apply more constraints to them, how that might lead lending and credit and intermediation to bleed out into non-bank financial institutions, which have less oversight. So very naturally, if they're subject to less constraints, you may expect to see more of these non-bank financial institutions providing credit. And so we did a study. Again, this is kind of in the same flavor of Julian. We have access to incredible administrative data. We have the expertise required to analyze that data very carefully to try and draw some conclusions and estimate the effects of these policies, potentially these unintended consequences of these policies on credit markets, how they function, and the different classes of investors that find it profitable to operate in these different markets.
So what is a, can you give what is a classic unintended consequence of regulation? Is there any regulation that really failed?
So if you think about a regulator, so if the regulator is worried about financial, this is a bit narrow, okay, because I appreciate you might have a very broad audience here, but if we have financial regulation, which the goal of financial regulation is to improve functioning of markets and avoid the likelihood of a financial crash. They worry about financial crashes, right? Yeah. So one way they can, if they look historically at financial crashes, they see commercial banks are involved in financial crashes. We just had three of the four largest bank failures in US history happen in the last, 15 months now. So it's this is what regulators are concerned about. So what do? They apply more constraints, more regulation, more restrictions to, say, commercial banks. Now, an unintended consequence that we look at in our research is, if you shackle the commercial banks and it's no longer profitable for them because there are large compliance costs and so on, it's no longer profitable for them to lend to young entrepreneurial firms, let's say, then you might expect other financial institutions to plug those funding gaps. So they might instead choose to lend. But those other financial institutions are subject to absolutely no regulation whatsoever, no oversight whatsoever. So on the one hand, we like risks to be dispersed in the financial system. If we have greater diversity of financial institutions, just more financial institutions, that's a good thing. We think we believe that's a good thing. However, if those financial institutions, they themselves get large and they take on excessive risks and they're prone to default and they're prone to panics. So BlackRock, for instance, has $10 trillion of assets under management. You add up the three largest commercial banks in the US, you don't get to $3 trillion. So we're so worried about these commercial banks, but then you have large asset managers and fund managers and hedge funds and investment firms. And the size of that sector, at least in the United States, it dwarfs the size of the commercial banking sector. And there's very little oversight. And in fact, there's even a greater shift in intermediation, in lending and so on, towards private credit markets, especially in recent years. And arguably, at least some of that reflects greater regulation at these kind of conventional or traditional financial institutions.
It's brilliant. And one more question I have. I'm in the process of applying for a mortgage. So I've been reading about it. So why is it the US...
Terrible time to apply for a mortgage.
Exactly, I know. But tell them, why is it the US has a 30-year mortgage and many other countries...
Well, that's a longer conversation.
Okay,
arguably, the US has this very unique structure in the mortgage market. So the system of mortgage finance in the US collapsed during the Great Depression, and they established these things called government-sponsored enterprises to support the mortgage market. So you may have heard of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Ginnie Mae. Those are Depression era, most of those are Depression era institutions that exist to basically support the mortgage market in the US. And one of the products that emerged over their lifetime has been this 30-year fixed rate mortgage. At least in part, that reflects the securitization. Well, you have securitization in other countries as well. So it's not just about securitization in the United States. I think when people typically look at the structure of mortgage lending in the US, they point to these government-sponsored enterprises as being kind of the linchpin in that market, and that's why we have the 30-year fixed rate.
So if I were
essentially the government bears the interest rate risk. The government is bearing the interest rate risk on behalf of the citizens, because we believe home ownership is very important in this country. In other countries, you see subsidies to the mortgage market in a variety of other ways, but that you don't see that same 30-year fixed rate product, which is really interesting. It's something I discuss in my classes. You're welcome to join if you want to. But I'll tell you, it's a terrible time to get a mortgage. I don't know. Yeah. It's a terrible time to get a mortgage.
I have to have a house to live in, Russ.
I guess you have to live somewhere. You can rent my basement. You're very welcome to come and join.
Wonderful. The six of us will come to your basement. Anyway, back to, actually, you both talked about your research. Julian, you said you do this causality studies. I know you teach the big data class in the MSF program. So, do you use much of your research in the classroom? Like, how does it influence? Do you update your notes for new research? Like, how does your research influence what you do in the classroom?
Yes, I incorporate research in a couple different ways. So in this class, the students learn how to apply sort of state-of-the-art machine learning methods to predict various outcomes, as well as learn how to apply modern causal inference methodologies. And I will typically use as applications in the class elements from both my own research or research that others have done. So we will have, actually to go on Russ's banking example, one of our applications when we learn about how to estimate difference and differences is a banking application. So there was a big banking panic in the US in the early 20th century. One part of the country had very tight lending policies, other one had looser policies, and we use that to try to understand, can we back out or estimate what is the effect of these various types of policies on the number of banks that failed. All right, so that's an example of bringing in research that I was not involved in myself, but is a very important topic in finance and is something that we can actually estimate ourselves in class. I will also bring in elements of my own research. So to go back, for example, to this workplace wellness program research that I mentioned to you before, all of the data that we used in this study are publicly available. So we've posted them online. So one of the things that I do in the class is, as an assignment, the students will download the actual administrative data that we used in this study and replicate some of the numbers that we published. So the students will, for example, estimate what is the causal effect of this workplace wellness program on worker productivity. They'll estimate this using modern methods as well as older methods that don't work as well. We'll see whether or not the answers are the same, talk about why those might be different. And this is meant to sort of echo how firms do A/B testing in the real world, which is something that has become a lot more popular at places like Google, Facebook, and Amazon. At all these companies, it is now routine to use randomized experiments to understand what is the effect of this price change or this changing the characteristics of this product on sales, for example. And so there are several different ways that research gets brought in. I like to have the students use real-world data whenever possible because, as most of us are aware, real-world data is always much messier, right, than the made-up data that we sometimes use in textbooks and for simple examples. And so I think it's important to get your hands dirty a little bit, so to speak, with what are some of the challenges that are involved in getting data ready for an analysis as well as how to do the analysis.
Yeah, Russ, you teach like a financial institutions risk management class. So
yeah,
it sounds
banking
like
and financial regulation.
Yeah. Sounds very exciting. It is exciting though, right? I mean,
It is very exciting. It's a moving target, though. That's the problem. Regulations change all the time, so it's I'm sorry. What's the question?
I don't know. It's supposed to be research you've done, or maybe even your
the research yes, it's a moving target. I mean, we have conceptual frameworks that we work through in our class, and I think having a solid understanding. I mean, what I try and have the students, having a solid understanding of those conceptual frameworks, how we think about, what it is that these financial institutions are doing, how they're adding value, what the various frictions are in these financial markets are, why we need these intermediaries and so on, why we need banks to do what they're doing, how banks think about risk management, and then, why the government thinks there may be market failures and therefore scope for intervention and regulation. That's kind of very broadly speaking what we do in my MSF class. There's plenty of scope for research to inform, and new research to inform what it is we do. So I think having my own personal work, I work, as I mentioned, I work in this area, but I'm also I'm sure this is true for Julian as well, and all of us, we keep up to date with exactly how that, the bleeding edge of what is going on, and we're able to incorporate that into the classroom, which I think is very important. So for instance, I always give this example of or I give an example or I complain about it. The Federal Reserve System, the central bank of the United States, the paradigm of how they do monetary policy has shifted dramatically since the 2008 financial crisis. So we've moved from a system, prior to the crisis, we were doing something called conventional monetary policy, where, this is the way the Federal Reserve had operated for 100 years. And then since 2008, interest rates were essentially cut to zero. So the Federal Reserve had to change what it is they were doing in order to accomplish their monetary policy goals. And so, the Fed themselves has been unable to successfully communicate their own their own new paradigm of monetary policy. And so for the last 10 years, I'll speak for myself, I've been trying to incorporate that new paradigm into the classroom. And that required, a good understanding of, the research that was going on, the cutting edge of research, because we could, being able to read that research that's been put out by the Federal Reserve System itself, by the New York Fed, by the Board of Governors, and trying to incorporate that into the classroom has been very important. And then the work that I've been doing myself, trying to understand more recent attempts in terms of financial regulation to, you need a solid foundation. So it's not just about, what's happening in the newspaper in the morning and how that might affect your teaching. There are solid principles that underpin what we're going through in the classroom. And those principles have not changed for hundreds of years, right? They've been more or less the same. But the students I get from the MSF program, they have industry experience, they are going into industry, they want to have an understanding of how things are shaping up today. And in that regard, I think having an understanding of how the paradigm is shifting and recent case studies and examples and so on, and how they can, and recent research papers and so on, how that work can be incorporated into the classroom. I think it's very important. And I think it adds a lot of value. I think the students enjoy that a great deal.
And did your time at Morgan Stanley teach you anything?
Yeah, I had a great time at Morgan Stanley. So I worked in investment banking in Canary Wharf in London. It was straight after I was done with my master's program. It was a lot of fun, made a lot of friends. And yes, it has certainly informed my research. For the first, during my PhD and beyond, I've been studying syndicated loan markets, which is really the bread and butter of what investment bankers do. And so my own personal experience understanding how those various investment banking deals are organized and structured and so on. I mean, I wrote my PhD dissertation in that area, actually, funny enough. So yeah, it's certainly informed my own work, and I've certainly been able to bring some of that experience and knowledge to the classroom, yes.
And does the real world work different? I mean, it sounds like you were able to incorporate real things into your research.
Yeah.
Do the bankers behave like the models? I mean, what was your experience?
Well, the models are abstraction. Yeah, I don't know. That's a big question. Isn't it? No, that's a fun question. I mean, the models are always an abstraction of reality, and it's always a simplification, right? So, I mean, I think that, honestly, I think we're at the most applied. We're not building bridges and dams, but we're about the work that I do and the people that work in my area of research is about as close to real world and practical as it gets. Right. I mean, I think it's a great area to work in because lots of people are always interested in what you're doing and what you're writing on, and it has direct policy relevance. So some of the work that I've been involved with, I've been fortunate to be involved with, has led to kind of fine tuning of some of these policies. Central banks care about it. The central banks all over the world care about it, and the kind of the Treasury and other areas of the U.S. government are interested in the sorts of work that I've been involved in. Yeah, I'm sorry, what was the question?
No, it was more sort of, as you have the industry experience,
yes.
One of the questions students ask, is this really what happens in banks, right?
Yeah.
Do they really care about the models we teach in class?
Yeah, we're trying to model, so when we think about incentives and behavior in the type of research that I do, and we're really trying to understand how these bankers are thinking, their various interests that they have to take into account. Yeah, it's very practical, it's very kind of sensible, it's very grounded work. No, that's certainly the case. I mean, is it the perfect model? No, it's not the perfect model. Are there instances that we're not doing a good job describing? Probably, and that's actually part of the fun of doing research. I mean, when you uncover something that's not well understood or well described by the current set of models, then we need to develop new models, or we need to understand why that phenomenon is emerging in markets and what we're doing wrong.
And then also, I mean, the type of thing you teach in class, like it's interesting that things are changing all the time, right? The things that learned 10 years ago about regulation is always updating.
Except for Basel III. Which is still rolling out.
So thank you both. I have another slide here, because what I want to talk about for sort of the next 30 minutes or so is more about what the experience you have in the classroom. So talked a lot about the research and how the research informs the classes, but a few of you in your questions you sent to me in advance were sort of worried about what evaluation is like in the classroom, what the teaching philosophy of the department or the program is. So now we have some experts in the room. I wanted to talk a little bit more about specific classes, what you expect to see, what we expect from you when you arrive in the program in August. So first thing that you're hopefully aware of is we have pretty long semesters. So each of our courses are going to run for 15 weeks. You have typically 2 classes a week of 80 minutes. So you have 10 minutes to get between classes. We block it off into an hour and a half sessions. You have 1 day off. So 29 class sessions over the 15 weeks. So there's a lot of material we can get through in our 15 weeks. In the US, academic freedom is very important. So there's sort of no there's no sort of exact way that everyone's going to teach. Each professor will decide on what they think is most important in terms of assessment and content. So some of us are very traditional, like myself. So I will have a midterm, I will have a final, I will have some assessed homeworks, and that's what a lot of people will do. But if professors are teaching a cases class, you may get points for participation. You may be doing presentations. Some professors like to give sort of random quizzes within sessions and have a lot of different assessment pieces. So in a second, I'll ask my panelists what they do, but just bear in mind, every professor will be different and you can determine which style you like, right? So maybe you like putting all the weight on a midterm and a final. It may be you prefer to be assessed on your contributions in class, and then you might like electives, which reward you for participation and being prepared for each session. I should mention about 4 or 5 of you asking questions about PhD, and again, I have a question I'm going to ask my panelists about that in a second, but the program is designed as a professional master's program. So all of our faculty members, the structure of the program is primarily designed to prepare you for industry jobs. So as Russ described very nicely, actually Julian too, there's sort of 2 parts to that. One is you need to learn the theory, right? So knowing fundamental finance theory, knowing the key ideas of how incentives inform behavior can be applied even in 20 years' time when regulations have changed and when markets have changed. So first part is to understand the key theory, and then of course to understand what's happening right now, and that's where the practical tools come in. So exactly what will Basel III say, or what does it say, exactly how to do an A/B test, how to do machine learning. So that's sort of the second part to what you're going to learn here. But if you are interested in PhD, if you're interested in future research, joining Russ in understanding how banks behave, there will be a couple of classes which will prepare you for PhD study, but I will talk about that in a question in a second. So again, I promised I wouldn't talk too much, so back to our panelists. So let's start with Julian again. What's your teaching philosophy? So when you're preparing a class or when you're in the classroom, what is it you think is important? How do you structure your classes? And do you think most professors are similar to you, or do you sort of have a unique approach to teaching your classes?
So when I teach a class, most of my classes I will split into 2 parts, along the lines that you were just talking about, Martin. I will have a theory part where I explain, for example, how a particular tool works, what its purpose is, what you need to be thinking about if you're going to be using this in your model. And then the second half of the class will typically involve an application of the tool. So, this is all well and good in theory. If I actually want to go and estimate this model or use this tool, right, how do I do that, right? And so for that, we will open a data set, and then, we will write some code that will allow us to estimate this model. And then we'll talk about how to interpret the actual numbers that are produced on your computer screen. So that's how I generally approach the topic, at least in this big data class that I teach. In terms of assessment, it takes several different forms. So I do have a traditional midterm and final, which will typically focus more on the conceptual aspects of the class. But as I mentioned, that's not all that matters when you do data analysis. So part of the grade or part of the assessment is also based on a series of homework and lab assignments that I assign to the students, which helps them get comfortable with computer programming and comfortable with applying and estimating models. There is also a large final project that's part of my class where students download a large real-world data set and again apply some tools to this data set, gain some familiarity with how to work with the data, clean it, and put it into a form that they can actually use to estimate their model. Some of these will be things that students can do together with teammates if they choose. So again, in the real world, you're typically not working on things by yourself. You will have colleagues that you work on. And so I'd like to replicate that a little bit in the classroom. So if you want to work on the project with one or two classmates, that's fine. Same typically with the homework assignments. But of course, the midterm and the final exams, those are solo assessments and are meant to make sure that the students understand, again, conceptually, the material that's being taught.
Do you think that's standard? Are you sort of unique in your sort of hands-on stuff, or is that what most of your colleagues do you think?
That's a good question. So it's hard to say without having done a comprehensive assessment. My sense is that this is fairly typical, but I know there are certainly some classes that use a very different format. But I think a midterm and a final combined with a lot of graded assignments that are sometimes you can work on in groups. I think this is fairly common, at least from some of the people I've talked to who also teach in this program.
And how big is your typical class size? So you're saying what coding? You say they do code? What language do they code in?
Yeah. So in my class, we learn how to code in R, which is a freely available piece of statistical software. And we also learn how to do it in AWS, Amazon Web Services, which is an online cloud infrastructure. And so this is a nice opportunity, I think, for students to learn how a lot of modern computing is done. Again, this gets back to, I think, what Russ was talking about before about things evolving and changing over time. Over the last 10 or 15 years, especially when you do big data analysis, it is typically now not done on your desktop. It is done on a server, which is located in the cloud. And so one of the things that we learn about in the classroom is how to run analyses on Amazon Web Services. Okay, and this is exactly what the biggest how the biggest analyses are done at places like Google or Amazon, Facebook. They're using these same kinds of services. And this is so this is something that the students learn about in terms of how to do these kinds of analyses.
Thank you. Russ, what's your teaching philosophy? You
Teaching philosophy. I don't know if I have a teaching philosophy. Learn something, have fun. I think Julian's. Correct me if I'm wrong. That sounds more like a foundational class. I think that's something that you could. Mine is more of an elective class. So I think in Julian's class, it sounds like every student should take Julian's class.
Nearly everybody takes the big data class.
You're going to use that as a building block, and then you can advance and take your electives. In my class is an elective class. Many of the students that I get in my class are interested. They either have a background in banking or working at a financial institution, or that's something that they aspire to do.
Yeah.
So it's an elective class. So I feel like it's a bit elective. It's a little bit. It's more specialized, I should say. Yeah. And so my teaching philosophy, I think just learning and having fun. I guess. It's do
you have a lot of? Is it a discussion class?
It's everything. So we do everything. We do everything. I like to just throw everything at everybody. We do, in terms of the structure of the class, we have discussion. We talk about case studies. There's a traditional lecture format as well. There are group projects throughout this, group assignments, group projects throughout this. I have 4 big group assignments throughout the semester, midterm, final. I don't have any pop quizzes. I'll say that. We don't have any pop quizzes, but otherwise we do everything. In terms of methods, we do what Julian's just described. We look at research articles that do use these sort of modern methods of empirical analysis. We have newspaper articles that we discuss. We have policy documents that are put out by either central banks or other government agencies that we discuss. I have more kind of conceptual. We work on conceptual frameworks, and I assess those conceptual frameworks. We work with real loan documents, things like that. So going back to the syndicated lending, we have, we do Norwegian cruise lines. It's a really fun new case study that I just recently developed, which is looking at the cruise line industry, Norwegian cruise lines during the COVID-19 pandemic. So that was a lot of fun, analyzing some of those documents, looking at loan renegotiations. So we look at various iterations of the contracting that was done between JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, and so on, and Norwegian, and looked at how that evolved through 2021 and 2022. I like to do kind of a bit of everything, but then at the end of it all, we do have a midterm and a final. So it's kind of traditional in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, and the question I often get during, say, registration process is sort of, what is your expectation in terms of like math and statistics background? So you talked about sort of models. Do you derive a lot of stuff? Do students need to know calculus? Like, what's sort of the level of math and stats that you would expect?
Well, it sounds like Julian. That's a question for Julian. My class is non-technical, so okay. I've gone out of my way to make it as inclusive as possible. So I don't require any kind of knowledge of calculus or differential, any of that kind of stuff. Don't need any of that. That's for the options pricing class.
That's for my class. Yep.
If you take Martin's class, if you're a geek or techie, take Martin's class. My class, I try and make it as inclusive as possible. We do look at statistics. We do look at data, but it's done in kind of it's just mostly descriptive analyses. So it's very non-technical.
Julian, what about you?
So in terms of prerequisites, the only prerequisites for my class are modest knowledge of mathematics. So we don't do calculus. You don't need to know calculus, but you should be competent and able to calculate net present values, deal with basic algebraic equations, things like that. We also don't require any pre-existing knowledge of programming in my class. As a matter of fact, the first few weeks of my class will be spent learning how to program in R and how to use Amazon Web Services. So that will take up the first, maybe 5 or 6 weeks of the class. And then from there, we move on to learn about machine learning, so things like random forest, lasso, basic regression analyses. And again, here, I don't assume any pre-existing knowledge. It's certainly helpful if you've been exposed to this material before. It's always easier to learn something the second time around. But I will teach everything from the basics on up. And as I always tell the students, I will provide you with all the resources you need to be successful in this class. So as one example, while we do cover programming in the class, I also provide lots of links to other websites and other tutorials for students who either wants to get extra practice getting comfortable with programming, or some students are very excited about programming and wants to go beyond what I do in the class, which is always great. I'm happy to encourage that. And so I provide materials for those types of things, but the prerequisites are not large. That said, I expect students to learn the material. So at the beginning, there can be a lot of work involved if you've never programmed before, or if you have very little knowledge of statistics. You're going to have to do a little bit more work, perhaps relative to some other students who have more familiarity with some of these technical tools. But I provide everything to the students. I don't assume prior knowledge of any of this.
Yeah, and I should mention that in your first semester of study, you will have the opportunity to take at least 2 classes in statistics if you want to. So one's recommended for everybody. That's going to teach you sort of basics of regression. If you've not done statistics in a few years, remind you of normal distributions, basic calculations, correlations, things like that. And also, they mentioned you should be able to do net present values, discounted cash flows. We do also have sort of intro to finance class in the first semester. For those of you who have done no finance study before, you will learn all the basics. Everyone else will typically go to our investments class, where you'll learn much more advanced fundamental financial theory. Harsh has put a question in the chat here. I appreciate that. Talking about CFA2. So this actually is a perfect question. I was going to talk about stuff like this. So, a lot of you have decent finance knowledge. Some of you may have an undergraduate degree in finance. Some of you, as Harsh said, may have CFA level 2. So you've learned a lot of finance theory already. So what is the MSF program adds? And I think so the simplest answer to that is exactly what Russ and Julian are talking about. If you know about Basel III because you've studied a CFA module, the CFA module is not the same as Russ, who half his or 2/3 of his time is spending researching this exact thing, right? So the extra knowledge he can provide comes from his research, comes from the amount of time he spent thinking about these ideas. And so I don't need to add anything there, Russ, but like, it's same my derivatives class too. I have a lot of students who come into my derivatives class. They say, do I need to take your class? I've taken an undergraduate course, or I've done CFA 2. I say, well, stay for a couple of weeks and see what you think. And although we cover the same theory, of course we do, the extra stuff is the examples we bring in, the case studies we've developed, sort of our extra insight on top of what you can learn in a textbook. Right? We're always been able to buy the textbooks and read these things ourselves. In the classroom, it's our own experience, our own research, which sort of adds the extra 40-50% on top of making sure everybody can do the theory, even if they've not learned that before. Do you guys want to add anything to sort of, I think that's
well said. Yeah, I think that's well said.
Yeah, okay. The PhD has come up a reasonable amount. I was briefly say about PhD study. Of course, most of our electives are designed to learn more about industry practice. So, for example, if you take a financial risk management elective, you will learn about default models. You will learn about value at risk and estimating volatilities and things like that. That is kind of designed if you wanted to work as a risk analyst on something like that. However, if you're interested in PhD study, often what you need is sort of more rigorous theory. I will say in our required classes, like say investments, I know Professor Pollitt, who teaches investments, he's a very rigorous type of gentleman. He will make sure you know the theory very, very well. But that is, of course, not enough to be prepared for PhD. However, we do have taught PhD classes, and MSF students are welcome to register for these classes, typically in their second and third semesters. And indeed, I would say classes like Julian's big data class, those kind of statistical techniques are useful for research as well as for industry work. We have a great class on financial data management, which teaches how to organize data sets. That's incredibly important if you're doing any empirical research, knowing how to merge CRISP and CompuStat, sort of like your classic statistical technique. But I think, Julian, I'm going to put you on the spot here. You were sort of informally advising one of our students who got into a good PhD program. What are some of the things she did? What are some of the things she was able to do with the program to get into a PhD program?
So I agree with everything you said, Martin. I mean, the program is not structured as a launching pad for a PhD program, but there are occasionally students who discover a love for finance and for economics, which of course all of us who have PhDs are very sympathetic to. So I've had on occasion a few students who have approached me and said, I'm interested possibly in going down this path. And I think one of the nice things about being at a university with a top finance department like ours is there are additional classes that students can take to help prepare them for a program like that. So as you mentioned, Martin, there will typically be some additional classes a student would need to take. In this case, for a student I was advising about a year ago, she needed some additional mathematics classes. So I recommended some to her, which she was able to take while she was here on campus. Happy to report she was recently admitted to multiple PhD programs and will be attending a top one. So I think, if a student finds themselves in this position, what I would recommend is reaching out to some of the professors and just asking, what would be the best way to pursue this path? Because I think it is important to realize there are some additional things you will probably need to do in order to maximize your chances to get into a PhD program.
Yeah, I will my advice when I have students come to ask me about PhD, there's two things that are very important. One is let us know as soon as possible. So you will have to take slightly different classes pretty much from the beginning. As Julian said, a lot of PhD programs will want a lot of math. If you don't have a math undergraduate degree, there's a lot of catching up you have to do in terms of math. So PhD classes, definitely math. MSF classes, Russ, you can get away with Russ's class without knowing much math, but interested in research, you have to know more mathematics. The other thing is, you may want to go to PhD because you think you don't want to network. It's hard in industry. You have to talk to a lot of people. Sadly, PhD is exactly the same. The best way to understand it is talk to your professors, go to office hours, ask their advice, ask them for if they have any research assistant positions. It's all, sadly, at this stage in your career, a lot of networking is important for everything, right? And so if Russ is teaching you a class and he's interested in research, don't be shy. Ask him what he's interested in. Does he have any advice for you about PhD programs? Because ultimately, knowing people, getting advice is sort of the best way to get ahead. And one other thing I was about to say was, ask advice. There's something else I thought of, but I've forgotten what it is. Oh yes, so Tagi had a question here. Can students collaborate with professors and publish articles? It's finance research is slightly different from others. It's very, very rare that a master's student or even sort of early stage PhD students would get their names on articles. But professors do occasionally need research support, and I will throw it to you guys. What kind of research support do you need?
I just want to echo what you guys were saying there. So over the years, I've had lots and lots of MSF students that have been interested in PhDs and gone on to PhDs. And so it's certainly, it's doable, but I would say, I'd echo what Martin said there, is that if this is something you're interested in or something you have in mind or something that's kind of, in the front of your mind, the sooner you speak with faculty when you arrive on campus, the better, because we can help send you in the right direction in terms of the sorts of coursework, be it math and statistics coursework, but also some PhD level coursework. I believe in the past, we've either had students take that coursework or audit those classes. And the nice thing about at some point, I should know this, but at some point the MSF went from, it can be a 3-semester program.
Most of you will do 3 semesters.
And so that opens up the summer, and there's a summer program at the U of I where people can take math classes and things like that. So I've had undergraduate students and I've had master's students in the same kind of situation, and you have lots of time you have enough time to kind of get things in order if that's an application you want to make.
And sort of RA work, do you guys use RAs at all? You ever used master's students?
We have, in the past I have, yes. Yeah. So we get requests. There are always, it depends on the faculty. So there are some faculty, and maybe Julian, this is more in line with what you do, that have these big projects with lots of data, and they have a need, essentially a lab structure, and they have a need for a lot of people to help out. That's not me. I tend to do smaller projects that are based with administrative data that's usually housed at, say, a central bank or at the US Census Bureau or something like that. So I have less need for boots on the ground here on campus. But there are lots of faculty in the finance group that do this sort of research where they do have a need for that. But yeah, again, you have to, as you say, you have to speak to the professors, see them after class, say you're interested. I wouldn't recommend just sending an email to every faculty member. You've got to speak to the human being, right? I mean, that can be the hard part sometimes. But we're used to hearing that, so you shouldn't feel embarrassed or anything like that. We're used to these requests, and we're used to meeting students, and we're used to people coming to office hours. We have to, if you don't like it, we have to interact with a lot of human beings all the time, so for better or for worse. But so we're used to hearing these sorts of requests, so you should make them.
Yeah, I agree with what Russ said. I think if you're interested in seeking out a research opportunity with a professor, I would start with talking to one of the professors from your classes. Let them know you're interested in a PhD, because first of all, they will at least help you sort out which classes you should take and so on to prepare. And you can always ask, do you have any research opportunities available? These vary by professor and even within professors over time. So on occasion, I have a large project where I could use some additional help. And so if there's a student who happens to be interested at that point in time, I might be able to use them as a research assistant. But oftentimes there's not any available opportunities. And so, certainly you should not take it personally if you don't get a position. It is difficult because oftentimes there's not a specific opportunity available for a master's level student. But I think the first step, as Russ said, you should reach out to the professor, let them know you're interested, ask them if there's, maybe are there other people who might have opportunities. Again, there may or may not be any that are available, but I think the first step is to reach out to network and let people know that you're interested and available if something should come along.
And I will say it's not necessary. So it's not. I would say it's not necessary to do. If you're, I mean, you should do it if you're curious to know what research is and you want to do a PhD. But it's not a necessary. I wouldn't say it's a necessary condition. I would say the coursework side of things and doing well in class and taking the right classes and speaking to faculty who will support you. We have research active faculty that know what it knows. We know what it takes to succeed in a PhD application, PhD proposal, and so on. So, PhD dissertation. So we're here for that. It's not necessary to publish papers while you're an MSF student. I wouldn't say that's a necessary condition.
Yeah, and to clarify on this, usually these research opportunities would not involve a co-authorship. That is very rare. Usually it is just an opportunity to help out.
Yes.
And again, I also agree with Russ. This is less important than having the proper coursework. Most students who are applying to PhD programs they have little or no research experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is not an unusual situation. But what is very important is having relevant coursework, because at the PhD level, it is a lot more technical, right? So in those courses, unlike my course and Russ's courses, there will be very high expectations of your knowledge of calculus, differential equations, proof-based math. It's very different set of requirements. And so that's really what's important to make sure that the student completes if they're interested in going down that path. And again, so those resources are here at this university because we have a top-notch finance department, economics department, and math department here. So all those courses are there if a student is interested, but it takes some time. So as Martin said, reach out as soon as you think you might be interested in this, so that you don't get started too late.
I will add perhaps a word of caution. I'm a naturally risk-averse person. Everything in finance is competitive. I mean, the sad thing is, that a lot of money can be made, a lot of people interested in this area. So industry jobs are competitive, PhD programs are also competitive. And so the way to get an edge is to get as much information as possible, right? So, we will do our best. We'll provide you with these great classes, and we're very, very proud of all the different classes that we have to offer. But you kind of have to use them, and the networking, the soft skills, talking to the professors is very important. It's true for PhD, it's true for industry, it's true whatever path you want to go down. So there is, excelling in your classes is one thing, but do use the other resources, do talk to the people on top of this as well. I think we're getting close to the end of my questions, certainly. We talked a lot about PhD there. It's great because in a lot of these sessions I focus more on our industry-linked classes. I will mention, as well as we have this research expertise, in terms of advice about industry, this is where our specialized faculty come in. So in the program we have this new thing called the MSF Academy, and the Academy is a chance for you to work one-on-one with your professors and understand about the industry and what skills you need to succeed in industry. If, say, you're interested in working in a commercial bank, like Russ was talking about, what are the classes you should take there? What are the skills you should have? And just as we have research excellence, we also have industry excellence. So I would name check Rich Excel, who's incredibly helpful in working with students. He's been a trader for many, many years. He's one of our MSF Academy mentors. He can talk to you about what he would expect when he's hiring students, what skills he wants you to learn, and then in his classes, he obviously is going to train you in a lot of these skills that will be useful for industry. Okay, I had one more question on my list that was sent by you and made up by me, which is sort of an open question for everybody. So thinking the next 5 years in sort of finance or in your areas, do you see any big questions coming up, any problems, any trends? What sort of, this time next year, what's everyone going to be talking about? What do you think? A hard question for you, Russ.
That's a ridiculous question, isn't it?
Well, high interest rates, right?
What are the big trends in banking and financial institutions? Well, I mean, it's usually, people talk about fintech, right? So, I mean, it's usually kind of financial technology, whether these big banks, we need them, whether they're adding value, how they're adding value in a world where we have, you know, big data and statistics and machine learning, and we have all of these small text, AI, fintech startups over there in the research park and so on. So what is the role as we go through another credit cycle? So now it's becoming very interesting. So yes, okay, so yeah, to your question, as we move through this credit cycle and we see these different types of lending this is very narrowly you see these different types of lending models, these different types of funding structures and so on. So how a typical fintech startup is funded as compared to a traditional commercial bank that will take deposits from people like us and lend those deposits out. As we move through the credit cycle, as we've seen interest rates go up and the cost of market-based finance has changed, how do we see those different types of funding structures stressed? Can those different types of lending models actually, you know, are they truly efficient, or are they reflecting, you know, differences in regulations and so on? I mean, we should see some of that shake out in the next couple of years. So that's exciting for me right now. I mean, I have no plans to teach about that or anything like that, but that's something I've been spending some time thinking about. Yeah.
Okay. Julian, put you on the spot.
Yeah,
So
no, I think there's a lot of exciting trends in data analysis. I'll mention two. So one has been ongoing now for about 5 or 10 years, which is a growing realization among companies that there is a difference between machine learning and causal inference. Okay, so I'm not going to get too much into that right now because that in some sense is the overarching theme of the class that I teach. But I think there's a growing understanding among firms that you really need to understand the models that you are using in your big data analysis, okay? And there are machine learning models which are very good for prediction. And there's a different class of models that are used, for example, by A/B testers, right, that allow you to estimate the causal effect of something, okay? And more and more companies are using this and finding that all the answers that they thought they had with their old machine learning models were incorrect. And in fact, they need to be using a different set of tools. So that's, I think, one big trend that's starting to change in industry. And that's actually one of the reasons why I focus on it in my class, because it's not widely taught yet in a lot of other big data analytics courses. And of course, I think the other huge earthquake that happened in the last year or two are large language models, right? I mean, 3 years ago when I was teaching this,
I was going to ask you that question.
It was not, no one had heard of this, right? And I think where that's going, remains to be seen. So in my class, we dip our toe in the waters of this just a little bit. We do learn about artificial neural networks. So students will learn the concepts and the theory behind these models, right? So how does an artificial neural network work? It, roughly speaking, is kind of like emulating the way the human brain works, okay? And so you will learn a little bit about sort of what is the underlying architecture of these large language models. Now, where they're going to go, I don't think I have any better guess than anybody else. I mean, they're clearly very successful in terms of being used in the realm of language. Will they find application in data analysis? I'm not sure. We haven't seen that yet. As that continues to evolve, of course, I'll be continuing to modify the class to reflect what's going out there in the world. So far, right now, it's a small part of it, but it's certainly exciting to watch all of that. We will certainly be talking about that in the class. So I think it's a very, one of the most exciting topics in computer science and data analysis these days.
Okay. I think that's sort of that was the last question I had on my list. We're just over the hour. Thank you, gentlemen, very much for giving up your time and for wonderful insights. Thank you for those of you who sent questions in advance and put questions on the chat. It's been a great session. I hope you've enjoyed it as well, and I look forward to meeting all of you in August. Thank you, everybody.